And we are joined by Rabbi Elliot Goldberg. Go ahead and take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see all of you. Um, a few words of introduction, and then we'll jump into some text this morning. This week, we start chapter 2 of Bava Metzia, and as we're starting a new chapter, I chose to focus today on that new chapter to sort of lay out what we read the last couple of days and what's coming, instead of focusing back on the material that ended chapter 1. I hope that's okay. If you're a big fan of chapter 1, I apologize for that. I'm a huge fan of chapter 2. One of the first chapters of Gemara I ever studied. A shout out to my teacher, Rabbi Albert Diamond, Zichrono Livracha, who I studied with in 10th grade, and my Chavruta Meir Lakin, who I studied with this chapter. The memories of my first encounter with this are strong, and I feel them today as we look at the chapter. One thing just about Bava Metzia in general that I really like is that each chapter, more or less, introduces its own theme, its own area of law. Whereas I felt like in Baba Kama there was a broader theme, and the chapters sort of weaved one into the other. Each new chapter in Bava Metzia introduces a whole new area, which for me is always refreshing, because sometimes, especially with the Daf Yomi reading, I find like some Masechta could drag on a little bit. But each chapter in Bava Metzia starts something new. So when you get to a new chapter, you know you're gonna, well, we're still in civil law and we're still dealing with things related to property and ownership. It changes a little bit from one chapter to another. That's fresh for me. Chapter 2 of Bava Metzia is about found items and what you have to do with them. The Torah, of course, requires us to return found items to their original owners, and to do so actively. Like, we have an active obligation to try to find the owners of the items. And the rabbis take a look at that and realize there are times when that's easy to do. There are times that's hard to do, and they try to figure out the ins and outs of those rules. To help set the stage, a few assumptions the rabbis make that helps frame their legal thinking. So one is objects have owners until they don't. Meaning, right, my anything here, my pencil that's here on the desk, this is my pencil until I declare that it's no longer my pencil. So if I'm the owner of the item, it's mine, but I have the power to say it's ownerless. Hefker is the rabbinic term for that. And once something is ownerless, if you were to pick it up, you could take ownership of the item. If you were to find this pencil somewhere along the way, oh, I see from my Zoom screen it's blurry unless I put it right in front of my face. If you find this pencil, one of the things you have to think about is, does this pencil have an owner? And if it does, I have to return it. Or does this pencil no longer have an owner? And then I could just keep it. And that's where we start chapter 2. And with that, I'm going to turn to the text. I am putting right now into the chat a link to the slides that I'm going to show. You can watch the slides on the screen and look at them later, but I know some of you like to open up the slides and have those texts on your own. So I put it in the chat. There's a link there, and there should be permissions to access it. And now I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. And start the slideshow. Oh, sorry. I got too many Zoom windows in front of me here. Here we go. Slideshow. All right. Chapter 2 starts with a headline. We don't always get a headline, but it's sort of a chapter heading. These items belong to the finder, and these items one is obligated to proclaim. That sets up what's coming. There are some items you get to keep if you find, and some items you have to announce in order to move forward. And it's a great header, but leaves us with the question, which I'll get to in a minute. But what follows in the Mishnah is a list. These are the items that belong to the finder. scattered produce, scattered coins, bundles of grain, etc., etc. You can read all the things on the list on the screen to see. And then the Mishnah goes on to talk about some related things. And if you're studying just the Gemara in Daf Yomi, the first question that might come to mind is, wait, the headline on the page before is these items belong to the finder, and these items, one, you have to proclaim. But then we have a list that Rabbi Meir brings for us of just the items that belong to the finder. Like, where's the, so where's the other list of the items that you can, that you have to proclaim? It happens, it's 3 pages later. And it's a different list, but in some ways it's parallel. That some of the items on this list have counterparts on the next list. The challenge when you're studying just the Gemara and Daf Yomi is you don't encounter the next list for 3 days, and the new list can shed some light on this original list, which is why I think all of my teachers always taught me when you're starting to study a chapter of Talmud, the first thing you should do is read the chapter of Mishnah, meaning read in chronological order. First read the chapter of Mishnah, because when you read the chapter of Mishnah, then you know all the things from that chapter that the rabbis who are talking about the Mishnah and the Gemara are talking about, because as you know, the rabbis don't hold themselves to discuss things in chronological order. They sort of assume that you know things from other places. And this list of random items makes far more sense when you know the second list. I'm going to give you one example of this. We're going to spend some time today with scattered produce. So this says scattered produce belongs to the finder. The next Mishnah tells us that produce found in a vessel or produce that's in a pile, those are things you have to announce. And having that information starts to give us a hint at what Rabbi Meir is talking about here, because it gives us a hint about what is it about scattered produce that makes it for the finder. But we can understand that more when on the other side, right, produce that's organized into a pile, or organized, or produce that's held within some kind of vessel, right, a pot, a box, a crate, you have to announce, which seems to indicate, right, that right, if someone leaves a box, it's more likely that someone put a box of produce down somewhere and is coming back to it, as opposed to scattered produce that's sort of fallen all over the place. It's more likely that that person dropped it, doesn't know it's there, or dropped it and left it and is not coming back for it. Same thing you could do with coins also, right, on the list for coins in the other Mishnah. Here we have scattered coins, and there we have coins, right, in a pile, or coins stacked in a tower. And the difference is these items here seem to be, on one hand, maybe disorganized, where the second Mishnah has organized items. And that's a differentiating principle. If it's disorganized, it doesn't look like someone placed it there, which means it could be ownerless and you can have it. But if it looks more organized, the person's coming back. But another thing to note here is, right, they have baker's loaves, and on the list, on the next list has homemade, right, loaves of bread. This is loaves of bread from a bakery versus loaves of bread from a homeowner, right? And there the distinction is, like, baker's loaves are mass produced, right? From the bakery, all the loaves of bread sort of look the same, and you can't differentiate one from the other. But homemade loaves of bread are easier to identify, because, like, my challah looks very different from Rachel's challah when we bake, right? We both bake challah, but Rachel has a fancy touch in how she weaves the challah, and I do it messy. So you could tell different challahs come from different places, and it's easier to identify. And that's another factor between the two lists, like what's identifiable and what's not. These items on our list today that you can keep are sort of unidentifiable because they're generic. And the second Mishnah that comes later are things that have some specific sort of identifier to them that makes it easier to claim. So while we have this random list, it sort of hints at, in comparison to the second list, it hints at some of the factors that the rabbis are thinking about. When you find something, you have to think about, was it placed there, or does it look like it just fell? Is it organized or unorganized? Is it something that's identifiable or something that's generic? And based on your determination of those different items, you can determine if you can keep them. That's sort of some general principles that come out of this Mishnah. So we're going to turn to some passages from the Gemara about this. And one of the things I really love about the Gemara here is the first Gemara discussion of this Mishnah in so many ways is characteristic of all Gemara conversations. Now, every conversation in the Gemara is a little different, but there are so many like signature characteristics in the conversation that's coming. I find this is a great first sugya of Talmud for people to study because it's a way into how the rabbis organize their discussion. And if this is a template, it can open up some of the other things. So I want to comment as we go, both on the text and on sort of the structure about what the rabbis are doing. You'll see it's also a little complicated one. We've come to some smaller font. Hope that works for everybody. You can enlarge it on your screen, I think. But we'll go through it anyway. So the Gemara starts by saying scattered produce. It takes the first thing on the list, and the Gemara asks a definitional question. Right? Often the Gemara, the first thing it does is it defines a term in the Mishnah. Scattered produce. The Gemara asks, and how much produce in how large an area is scattered produce? Right? What makes something scattered produce? It's a great question, right? The Mishnah said scattered produce. The Gemara says, well, what do you mean? What's scattered? How do you understand what scattered is? And Rav Yitzchak comes and he says, it's considered scattered produce when it has a dispersal ratio of 1 kav in the area of 4 by 4 cubits. Thanks to our friend Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz for filling in the missing words, right? The Gemara actually says, Rabbi Yitzchak says 1 kav and 4 cubits. The commentary here fills in, right, all the missing words, which is characteristic of the Gemara. But Rabbi Yitzchak gives us a density, right? 1 kav, which is a measure of volume. It's about 1.25 liters-ish in an area 4 by 4 cubits. There's some, if you're a mathematician and you love to look at rabbi math, the commentators do a lot of conversation about when it just says 4 by 4 cubits. What does that mean? We'll see a little later why here we're probably most probably for it to work mathematically being a square 4 cubits by 4 cubits. A cubit is an arm length from an elbow to your fingertips. I know that's not standard. That's not a standard length because we all have different size arms, but sort of that's how it worked too. That's a foot used to be a foot, not 12 inches, but the length of a foot, same thing. I wish there was a cubit somewhere. I remember I was in Paris once and I walked by a building and on the building was like the original meter. Somewhere like they had like this is the meter. This is what was used to make a meter. But anyways, I digress. 4 cubits by 4 cubits. So there's a ratio, a certain amount of stuff in a certain amount of area. If it's thinner than if it's 1 kav in a 4 square cubit square or less, it's scattered. If there's more than 1 kav in a 4 by 4 cubit square, it's no longer scattered. It's a pile. So awesome. I love it when the Gemara is clear. Rabbi Yitzchak comes and says, I know what scattered produce is. Here's some numbers for it. Let's go by this. Awesome. Wouldn't that be great if that worked out? It would all be over here. But the Gemara says, well, tell me a little bit more about this kav in 4 by 4 cubits because I have some questions about it. Warm up your Talmud brains. This is like the Dr. Seuss. It's almost like a tongue twister, but we'll follow it together. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? It depends on the circumstances what you should do. Why? If you found, I'm going to use the good Gemara reading. If you found the produce scattered in a manner indicating that they came there by falling and not being placed there, then even if the volume in the area was greater than this limit, it should also belong to them because it's still scattered stuff that doesn't have any distinction mark that the owner can claim it. And if the produce was found in a manner indicating intentional placement, even if the volume of produce in the area was less than this limit, they should also not be allowed to keep it because you can see there's a pile and the owner could come back and it's identifiable. I left a pile of produce here by the side of the road. So the Gemara says, great, Rabbi Yitzchak, you have a rule for us, but your rule, well, it seems sort of arbitrary because if it's clear that this is like scattered fruit that seems like it fell and there's no organizing principle and it's just a bunch of apples or a bunch of wheat, even if it's more than a kav and arba mode, it's still like messy. It seems like it fell and no one's coming back for it. I should get to keep it. And if it's organized in a pile and clearly in a way that says, hey, that person's going to come back and for it, even less of a kav and arba mode, it shouldn't belong to me. It should belong to them. So what's the Gemara doing here? Right, we had a question, define what's in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yitzchak gives us a clear, simple rule. And then the Gemara comes and says, well, the rule is not necessarily clear. There are other factors that might cause us to move the rule in one direction or the other, and might not be a simple ratio of volume to square footage. It might have to do with the manner in which the fruit appears. Right? If it's scattered because it looks scattered, it shouldn't matter exactly what the density is. And if it's a pile because it looks like a pile, it shouldn't matter what the density is. So it could be like what it looks like, which might bring us back to the beginning. What's scattered fruit? Scattered fruit looks scattered. That's a little more subjective than Rabbi Yitzchak's piece, but the Gemara is saying maybe that's a better system for us. Next. Rav Ukva comes and says, well, wait a minute. What are we dealing with here? We're dealing with kernels of wheat on the threshing floor during the harvest. So what is that? What's happening here? Rav Ukva comes and does what the Gemara does a lot. He says, what was Rabbi Yitzchak talking about when he gave us a rule? He wasn't talking about a standard for just an object you find on the road or in the park or in the hallway at work. He's talking about this rule is what we use to measure scattered versus not scattered on the threshing floor during the harvest season. So what does that mean? There's a place on every farm or in every village or something where people would come during the harvest with their wheat. They'd put it on the floor and they would thresh the wheat. That's when they separate the wheat from the chaffs, right? The part we use from the part we don't use. And then you would do the separation on this floor where you needed a hard surface for. You'd take your stuff and you'd leave, and it's wheat, right? It's lots of small bits and pieces. And, I've never threshed wheat, but I can imagine after you thresh wheat, there's a little bit of mess on the floor. And when you take your wheat and go and the next person comes in, it's not 100% foolproof system. It's not a pristine factory where everything's spotless and clean. It's a place where some stuff gets left. So how do you know when something's left? If the person's going to come back for it or not? That's what we're dealing with when we say one kav of arba amot. So what does that mean? For kernels scattered with a dispersal ratio of 1 kav in the air of 4 by 4 cubits, whose gathering requires great exertion, a person does not exert themselves and doesn't come back to take them. So therefore, they don't own them, and the person who found them can eat them. But if it's scattered in a smaller space than that, the owner exerts himself and returns to take them. He doesn't renounce them. So what's the issue here? Rav Ukva first, what he's doing is contextualizing an earlier statement to give it context to understand where this formula came from, the threshing floor. But then then the discussion that follows is adding a new issue. Right before we dealt with, does the owner keep it or not? Does it look placed or dropped? What's the manner that it fell? But now there's an issue that comes that says maybe this ratio is about exertion. How much trouble is it for the person to come pick up the stuff? Right? Why does someone leave less than a kav of wheat kernels on the threshing floor? It's not worth it. I could clean this up, but it's going to take me an hour, and it's only a little bit of wheat, so I'm going to leave it there. But once it's more than a kav, it's worth it. Right? Or once the density is higher, it's easier, right? It's easier to sweep it up or collect it. So the ratio here is not measuring just the quantity of the stuff. It's actually the ratio at which the owner will come back and trouble themselves to collect the wheat that they left. And greater density than kav arba amot they will, lower density than kav arba amot they won't. And that's where we get this principle from the threshing floor. And if we apply this to all the other places, it could be that what the pile of scattered produce that you see looks like matters. But the new factor that now you have to take into account is someone going to come back? Is it worth someone's effort to come back and pick it up? And if it is, you can keep it. If it's not, you can't. Now, if this clarifies things, we'd be done. But our friend Rabbi Yirmiyahu is going to come in a second. Rabbi Yirmiyahu is known classically for asking questions that expose the flaws and or the weak side, the weakness in a particular rabbinic argument. And Rabbi Yirmiyahu comes with a whole series of questions. We're going to look at the language for the first one, and then I'll give you. I'll tell you where it goes from there, because it's really, reading through it is really a whole Dr. Seuss exercise. But Rabbi Yirmiyahu comes and says the following: well, what about half a kav of kernels that were scattered in an area of 2 by 4 cubits? What's the halakha? So Rabbi Yirmiyahu says, all right, you have a ratio, 1 kav in an area that's 16 square cubits. So he says, all right, what if we half it, half a kav in an area of 2 by 4 cubits? So right, he halves the volume and he halves the square footage. So now it's 8 square cubits. In theory, if the ratio is the ratio, it should apply. It's the same here, right? Half a kav in 8 square cubits is the same as a kav in 16 square cubits, same ratio. So if that's true, it should be the same. But what does Rabbi Yirmiyahu point out? If the case of 1 kav of kernels scattered in the area of 4 by 4 cubits, right? In this case, what is the reason the owner renounces ownership? It's because picking up the kernels require great exertion. But when we half it, half a kav of kernels scattered in the area of 2 by 4 cubits, it's not such a pain. While it's the same ratio, it's half a kav in 8 square cubits. It's not as much exertion to pick it up. So maybe, in this case, same ratio, but in this case, the rule should be different because there's less kernels of wheat, easier to pick up. So maybe the owner's coming back. Or maybe, says Rabbi Yirmiyahu, if the owner renounces ownership in the case of 1 kav of kernels scattered in an area of 4 by 4 cubits because they're not worth anything, there's no significant value. In the case of half a kav of kernels scattered in 2 by 4 cubits, since they're certainly not of significant value, then they're not going to come back. So what does Rabbi Yirmiyahu shows here? If we have this ratio and we say it's about how much effort it is, well, that could work on its own. But if I half the area, now I could say half the area, it's less exertion. So maybe it's more likely I'm going to pick it up. But half the area means half the volume. So the stuff is worth less. So then I'm more likely not to come and pick it up. So Rabbi Yirmiyahu says this rule you made just, gives me a headache, because if I divide it in half, it's the same ratio. But if we go with exertion, it leads me in one direction about what I should do. And if we go with value of the items, it pushes me in the other direction. Rabbi Yirmiyahu goes on, he doubles the value, 2 kavs in 32 square cubits. The opposite, same logic here, but pushed in the other direction. So more value, more exertion. He then puts the value and exertion together and says, does it make a difference if we use sesame seeds and pomegranates instead of kernels? Because sesame seeds are small, so they're hard to pick up, but sesame seeds are expensive, so they're worth more. So they're harder to pick up. That says the owner's going to not come to get them because they're a pain to pick up, but they're expensive. So the owner is likely to want to make the effort because they're of value. Whereas pomegranates on the other side, which are big and easy to pick up, the owner might come back and get if the issue is exertion. But pomegranates are cheap. So the same volume of pomegranates, I'm less likely to come and pick up than sesame seeds. And what do we do with all of that? It's lovely. It's classic Rabbi Yirmiyahu and classic the Gemara sort of saying, going back to Rabbi Yitzchak tried to give us a rule. And the rule, if we just took it and didn't think about it, could help because it's clear and it's mathematical and we could just use it. But once we start to think about the rule, we realize there are all these factors. How expensive is the item? How much of a pain is it to pick up? What does the pile look like? What level of exertion does the person have to do? And as I wrote about this week, well, to some, this sugya is really frustrating because guess what? At the end, they say, Teku, we don't know how to answer all these questions. These are great questions, and they've stumped us on the principle, and we're not going to give a clear answer to that. And some people could, 10th grade, Elliot threw up his hands and said, what? Teku, you've been there too, right? They're not going to tell me what the answer is, but mid 50s, Elliot says, that's a great answer because I'm a finder of lost things. You might be too. I spot things and say, there's a thing. And it's not that there's one simple formula when you're walking down the hallway of a school or you're in the park about what's worth returning and what's not. And sometimes you could look at like, this isn't worth anything, so it's garbage. I'm just going to throw it out. Sometimes you notice it's a valuable thing. Sometimes it's like a common item that like no one's going to come back for. Sometimes it's not. And there's no clear way to script the law for when you find some random object spilled on the road or in the park or in your place of work, when you have to announce them because the owner wants them and when you don't. I'd rather have all these different factors that come out of this discussion in Sugya here in the Gemara and leave it to me as a ethical citizen who both wants to give something back if it's possible to give it back and is wants to not carry that burden when it's not. And in some ways, the Gemara is saying, here are all the things you have to consider and then reason it out for yourself because we're not deciding for you. That's how I read the Teku here. And actually, the questions that they've given me, I found in my lifetime to be really good ones for me to look at a specific scenario and say, what should I do here? Is this something I have any hope of finding the owner and getting the thing back to them? And all the different things they discuss here have been very helpful to me. And I like that piece here. We're out of time. All right. I had one more thing to do, but I guess we're out of time because the Gemara has a lot. Let me come back to you. I'm going to stop share. That's a tour of this opening sugya. We might be able to squeeze in a question or two or a comment. I don't know if you've been able to, Rachel, follow the chat. I was not while I was teaching, but if there's something that's screaming out for us to address before we reach time, I'd be happy to.
I think actually we will go with a very basic question, which is when we say chapters of the Mishnah, what are we talking about? The Mishnah is divided into chapters. What does that have to do with the Talmud's chapters? Can you explain how that works?
Oh, sure. I skipped over that. That's a good one. I like that. Okay, so the Talmud is has two books really in it, two works in it. The Mishnah, which is 2nd century, let's call it, and then the Gemara, which is 3rd through 5th century, right? We can put it at the end, 5th century, 6th century. And they're put together. Because the Gemara is a discussion of the Mishnah, right? The structure of the Gemara follows the structure of the Mishnah. So the conversations in the Gemara are attached to different Mishnahs. The chapters in the Talmud follow the structure of the Mishnah, the chapters of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah as a book as a whole, as a work as a whole, is divided into 6 big sections, in Hebrew called starim. In English, we call them orders. It's almost Purim, but it's the same word as Seder for Pesach. Like the order of the Passover Seder, we have the order of the Mishnah. We could come back to that in a month. We'll do Purim first, then we go to Pesach. Within each of and each order is a big area of law. Right? We're in Nezikim now, which is about civil law. The orders are divided into Masechtot in Hebrew, tractate, we say in English. Those are more focused topics. Bava Metzia is our tractate now. And each tractate is divided into chapters. Chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, right? This week we finished chapter 1 and we started chapter 2 of Bava Metzia. So chapter 2 of Bava Metzia has a set of Mishnayot. And the rabbis in the Talmud, when they started talking about the Mishnah today that I brought, which was Mishnah 1, they already knew the whole chapter because the Mishnah came before them. In order to become a rabbi in the Talmud, you had to know the Mishnah to like qualify, right, to be a rabbi in the Talmud. And so they knew the whole chapter. And above Mitzvah, as I said earlier, each chapter of Mishnayot is on a much more focused theme also. So there's a whole series of Mishnahs about found items or lost items and your responsibility for it. And if you weren't doing Daf Yomi, the pace of reading means you just have to keep going every day. I would suggest you read the whole chapter of Mishnah first, so you're aware of the whole chapter before you read the Gemara. You could still do that, but now that we're in Daf Yomi land, all I read is Daf Yomi. So like, I know, like, thinking about a different way to read it, that might not be the way to study for Daf Yomi. Anyways, on one foot, that's where the chapters come from. And this new chapter that we started, Elam Mitziot, which we read today, is a classic one in the sense that it's often taught to new students of the Talmud, and it's got some lovely, lovely pieces in it. And someone just put in the chat, the Koren Steinsaltz English labels the chapters, right? If you're a Sefaria user and you go on to in the Talmud section, it's you could see the chapters and how they're divided as well as the pages. That's that.
Okay, I think we need to leave it there, unfortunately, but the learning will continue as always in your inbox tomorrow and in this space next week. Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg, for spending time with us in this classic sugya and making us feel both advanced and like beginners all at once.
Yeah, it's a lot there.
To all of you who may be like me, a little undercaffeinated today, good luck with the fast. And it is lovely to see you all. And we will see you very soon. And Purim Sameach, of course, this weekend.
Thanks for all the shout outs in the chat. I appreciate it. It is such a pleasure learning with this group. And I love afterwards, I try to scan the chat for all the questions and the conversations you have. Like, it's such an engaged learning community. You guys are awesome. And I'll see you in about a month, I think. But someone else will be here next week, and everybody who teaches this is really good. So you should come for everybody. And thanks, Rachel.
These people do.
Yeah, I see. I know these people. They're my friends. I see lots of friendly faces that I see all the time. It's good to see you guys. Enjoy Purim.
Thank you, everybody. And Shabbat Shalom, too.